In 1977, a Ford engineer named Harold MacDonald sat in a meeting room staring at a document that would effectively end an era. The paper in front of him outlined new federal emission standards taking effect in 1981. The numbers weren't just aggressive, they were, by the engineering consensus of that moment, impossible to meet with existing technology while maintaining any reasonable level of performance. MacDonald had spent his entire career making engines more powerful. Now his job was the opposite: figure out how to make them weaker, not as a design goal, but as an unavoidable consequence of meeting air quality mandates that gave automakers less than 4 years to completely reimagine how internal combustion engines functioned. What happened next would create what enthusiasts still call the Malaise Era, a period when even the mightiest American V8s felt gutless, when sports cars struggled to break 10 seconds in the quarter mile, when a Corvette could barely outrun a modern minivan. But the story isn't really about lost performance. It's about what happens when engineering runs into a hard deadline with no solution in sight. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1970 had set ambitious targets, but they included extensions and delays when technology wasn't ready. By the mid-1970s, Congress and the EPA had run out of patience. The oil crisis had shifted public opinion. Smog in Los Angeles and other cities had become a health emergency. The extensions were over. The 1981 deadline was final. Automakers faced a brutal calculation. The new standards required reducing nitrogen oxides emissions by 75%, hydrocarbon emissions by 90%, and carbon monoxide by 90% compared to pre-control vehicles. These weren't incremental improvements, they were fundamental transformations in how engines operated. The problem was that every method engineers knew to reduce one type of emission made other emissions worse. Run the engine leaner to reduce carbon monoxide, and you increase nitrogen oxides. Lower combustion temperatures to reduce nitrogen oxides, and you increase hydrocarbons. Retard ignition timing to reduce one pollutant, and you create others, while simultaneously destroying power and fuel economy. Engineers called it the emissions triangle. You could optimize for any 2 vertices, but the third would suffer. The 1981 standards required optimizing for all 3 simultaneously, something that seemed thermodynamically impossible with carburetor technology. So manufacturers did the only thing they could. They detuned everything. Compression ratios that had been 10-to-1 or 11-to-1 in the 1960s dropped to 8-to-1 or even 7.5-to-1. Ignition timing was retarded to the point where engines ran hot and inefficient. Camshaft profiles that had been designed for power were replaced with profiles designed to minimize emissions at any performance cost. The Chevrolet Corvette tells the story in stark numbers. The 1970 LS5 engine produced 390 horsepower. By 1975, the most powerful Corvette engine made 205 horsepower, a 47% reduction. By 1980, it was down to 190 horsepower. The car looked the same, the engine displacement was similar, but the experience of driving it was completely different. What's remarkable is that the detuning wasn't limited to performance cars. Every vehicle was affected. The family sedan that had been adequately powered became dangerously slow. Merging onto highways became an exercise in planning and hope. Passing required long stretches of clear road because acceleration was so limited. Cadillac faced perhaps the most embarrassing situation. The 1981 Cadillac Eldorado came with a 4.1-liter V8 producing 135 horsepower. That's less power per liter than most modern 4-cylinder engines. A luxury car weighing over 3,700 pounds with barely enough power to get out of its own way. Cadillac buyers, accustomed to effortless power and smooth acceleration, were baffled and angry.
But here's what made the situation particularly frustrating for engineers. They knew the detuning was temporary. Engine management, electronic fuel injection, and precisely controlled ignition would eventually solve the emissions triangle. Sensors could monitor exhaust composition in real time, and computers could adjust fuel and timing hundreds of times per second to optimize all three emission types simultaneously. The technology existed in laboratories. Bosch had demonstrated fuel injection systems that met emission standards while maintaining performance. Electronic engine management worked, but it was expensive, unproven in mass production, and required component reliability that didn't yet exist. Sensors failed, computers crashed. The electronics of 1977 weren't ready for the harsh environment under a car hood. So manufacturers were caught between a hard deadline they couldn't meet with available technology and a solution that wouldn't be ready in time. The result was 4 years of increasingly desperate detuning, taking engines that had been optimized for power and efficiency and crippling them to barely meet emission standards. The human cost of this transition gets overlooked. People who had saved for years to buy a new car found themselves with vehicles that were objectively worse than the used cars they'd traded in. A 1970 used car with 100,000 miles often felt more powerful and responsive than a 1980 new car with 0 miles. This created a perverse used car market where older pre-emissions vehicles commanded premium prices. A clean 1969 Camaro or Mustang was worth more than a new 1980 model. People actively avoided newer cars because they knew the performance would be disappointing. This had never happened before in automotive history. New cars were always presumed better. The emissions deadline had inverted that assumption.
The fuel economy situation made everything worse. You'd think that detuned engines would be more efficient. Less power should mean less fuel consumption. But the opposite happened. The extreme measures taken to reduce emissions, retarded timing, low compression, rich fuel mixtures, made engines thermally inefficient. They were converting less of the fuel's energy into motion and more into heat. So cars from 1978 to 1981 were slow and thirsty. The 1980 Corvette, with its neutered 190 horsepower engine, got 15 miles per gallon. The 1970 Corvette, with nearly twice the power, had gotten similar fuel economy. Engineers had sacrificed performance and gotten nothing in return. Insurance companies and safety regulators noticed another consequence. Accident rates increased on highways. Underpowered cars struggled to maintain speed on hills, creating dangerous speed differentials in traffic. Vehicles couldn't accelerate out of dangerous situations. Passing maneuvers took so long that drivers misjudged gaps in oncoming traffic. If this kind of analysis, connecting engineering decisions to their real-world impact, interests you, subscribe to Hidden Gears. There are 5 more stories in this series, each revealing a different technical choice that accidentally reshaped automotive history. The emission standards weren't wrong. Air quality in American cities was genuinely dangerous. Children were developing asthma, smog with reducing life expectancy. Something had to change. But the deadline forced a solution before the technology was ready, creating years of vehicles that satisfied neither performance nor efficiency goals. If you're watching this and remember those years, what was your experience? Did you avoid buying new cars? Did you keep an older vehicle running longer than planned? The comment section is the right place for those stories. This era affected millions of buyers in ways that often get forgotten in technical discussions about emissions and horsepower. By 1982, the worst was over. Electronic fuel injection began appearing on mainstream vehicles. Engine management computers became reliable enough for mass production. Suddenly, engineers could meet emission standards while recovering some performance. The 1985 Corvette jumped to 230 horsepower, not back to 1970 levels, but dramatically better than the Malaise Era. But here's the lasting consequence that's rarely discussed. An entire generation of buyers learned not to trust American cars.
People who bought disappointing vehicles between 1977 and 1981 remembered that experience for decades. When their next purchase came due, many switched to imports, particularly Japanese brands that had been engineering for emissions compliance longer and handled the transition more smoothly. Honda and Toyota had been dealing with strict Japanese emissions standards since the early 1970s. They'd already developed lean burn technology and primitive electronic engine management. When American standards tightened, they were better prepared. Their cars weren't fast, but they weren't dramatically slower than previous models. They met emission standards without the catastrophic performance loss that plagued American manufacturers. This helped establish Japanese brands as more competent and forward-thinking. Market share shifted in ways that would prove permanent. In 1975, imports represented about 18% of the American market. By 1985, it was 26%. The emissions deadline didn't cause this shift alone, but it accelerated a trend that would reshape the global automotive industry. The Malaise era also killed consumer trust in horsepower ratings. For decades, manufacturers had often inflated numbers, but from 1977 to 1981, the numbers didn't matter anymore. Everything felt slow, regardless of what the brochure claimed. Buyers stopped caring about horsepower specifications because there was no correlation with actual driving experience. A 1980 Mustang claimed 140 horsepower but couldn't outrun a modern Honda Civic. That skepticism persists. Even today, when manufacturers quote horsepower figures, many buyers remain suspicious. The Malaise era taught people that numbers on paper don't necessarily translate to performance on the road. That lesson has never been completely unlearned. There's also a broader pattern here about regulatory deadlines and technological readiness. The emission standards were necessary and ultimately beneficial. Modern cars are dramatically cleaner than 1970s vehicles, while being faster and more efficient. But the transition created years of terrible vehicles because the deadline came before the technology was ready. This same pattern appears throughout industrial history. Sometimes regulatory deadlines drive innovation. Manufacturers rise to the challenge and develop solutions faster than expected. Other times, deadlines force compromises that satisfy regulations on paper while creating worse outcomes in practice. The emissions deadline of 1981 was the latter case. Engineers knew electronic engine management would solve the problem, but they couldn't deploy it fast enough. So they detuned everything, met the letter of the law, and produced vehicles that disappointed everyone. By 1985, when the technology caught up, the damage to consumer confidence was done. The Malaise era lasted roughly 4 years, 1977 to 1981, but its consequences rippled for decades. It changed which brands Americans trusted. It altered the trajectory of domestic manufacturers. It taught a generation of engineers that meeting regulations isn't enough. You have to maintain the fundamental value proposition of the product. Harold MacDonald, that Ford engineer from the opening, retired in 1984. He lived long enough to see electronic fuel injection solve the problems that seemed impossible in 1977. But he also watched Ford's market share decline through the 1980s, partly because buyers remembered the disappointing vehicles they'd purchased during those years when deadlines and technology didn't align. The lesson isn't that emission standards were wrong. The lesson is that regulatory deadlines have consequences beyond their immediate targets. When technology isn't ready and deadlines aren't flexible, compromises get made. Those compromises have costs, economic costs, market share costs, and consumer trust costs that can take decades to recover. Every detuned decision made between 1977 and 1981 was technically sound, given the constraints. Engineers did exactly what regulations required. But the aggregate effect was an era of vehicles that satisfied almost nobody, changed brand loyalties, and reshaped the automotive industry in ways that persist today, more than 40 years after the deadline that started it all.
Here's the question worth considering. If you were an automotive executive in 1977, knowing electronic fuel injection would be ready by 1983, would you have pushed for a deadline extension, risking public health for 2 more years, or accepted the performance catastrophe and trusted that customers would eventually understand? There's no clear right answer, but your perspective matters. Share it in the comments.